So it's lesson 4, advanced server-side scripting. Today we're going to start looking around and using Express.js. We spent a few weeks just playing with Node to get an understanding of how it works. We've really just used Node on its own. We're never going to use Node again without Express. Express is the framework that kind of handles a lot of the web infrastructure. We write our code in Node, but we use Express to build out and run our application and handle things like our URL routing, etc. So Express is a middleware. I think we looked at a diagram. It kind of sits in between our Node code and our database. There's different types of templates we can use for our views. So in our ASP.NET MVC applications, we used Microsoft syntax called Razor. So we had things like, all of our server-side tags would start with the @ symbol. That indicated that it was server-side tag. When we use Node, we actually have several different template styles. Now, the default one is called Jade. We're not going to use Jade. Jade's kind of neat, but it's also really easy to break. So we're going to use a different templating style that's a little more forgiving called EJS. We'll maybe take a quick peek at Jade later. You can see how it works, but you can also see what the problems with it are. And then eventually we'll look at how do we deploy this up to the cloud. So we'll do this all today. Okay. So last week, the end of class, we used the Connect. We installed the Connect package, and we were using Connect. Just pull up our file from last week. So I'll just open up my code editor and it'll by default, it'll open up last week's project. We can just have a look at what we did last week for a minute. Eventually we'll close this. We're actually going to make 2 separate applications today, one with just raw Express code and then a new one using the generator. So last week we installed the Connect NPM package. We required it. And then we used Connect to basically start our server. We created a new application with Connect, listening on port 3000. And then we did some mapping of URLs, right? We created paths and each path called a different method and each method returned a different message. Now, Express actually uses Connect. So Connect is one of the dependencies. So under the hood, Express uses this same kind of infrastructure for running the server and mapping our URLs. So we won't reference Connect directly. We're going to install Express. Express will install Connect, and the Connect stuff just kind of happens under the hood. We don't necessarily see it. So this is kind of from the Express. We'll look at the Express.js site, the official site, in a minute. This is kind of their version, their first version of, a single page hello world. And as you can see, it looks pretty similar to what we've already done, right? Instead of requiring Connect, we are now requiring Express. Instead of creating the app with Connect, we create the app with the Express package. And then this is fairly similar. We map a path to a function and we listen on a port. Okay? So we're going to try this. This is kind of our simple example, but let's try this out. I should probably change these, update my file. So we're using let. There's only one thing in here that's kind of new. There's one line of code that we haven't seen before and is kind of different from what we did last week with Connect. What do you see here that is different? Did the app, we mapped our paths to some callback functions, and we listened. So we did virtually everything. We didn't log our message to the console, but I think by now everybody's clear on what console.log does. There's no big mystery there. The only thing that's missing is this line. Now this is key in Express. What this exports keyword does, this is kind of the same thing as in C# when we create a file or a variable and we declare it to be public. So we don't use the word public in Express, we export it. Export it means make it visible, make it available to other parts of the application. So this is the Express equivalent of making all the code in this file publicly available in the application. So every one of you is going to have this problem sometime in this course, I guarantee it, including me. You're going to write an entire file and it isn't going to run, or we're going to get a reference error saying like we can't find it. And the issue is going to be at the very bottom, we forgot to export that file, meaning all our code in it is right, but when we try and call it from some other place, it's not visible. So Express has these objects similar to Connect. It's got an application, a request, and a response object, just like we used last week in our callbacks, right? We had request, response. We have the same things in Express. I'm going to go to Express.js.com, so it's the official homepage. My slide may be a little bit out of date. So they've got good examples. So first, we better go to our installation. So we've already installed, it says, assuming we've installed Node and we've already created a directory. We haven't done that yet. So let's go to our command prompt. Let's make a directory, or you can create the directory in Windows, doesn't matter. So I'll go into my would help if I was in the right place. Okay, so rather than just make a week 4 folder, because we're going to make 2 applications today, I'll make this first folder and call it week 4 simple. And so this is kind of our starter example, and then we'll do a separate week 4 with the Express generator later. Or if you want to call it week 4 part 1, whatever. So you can create the directory through your command prompt, or you can create it through your Finder or your Windows Explorer, whatever way. And then I want to go to this folder in my command prompt now. So I'll just copy that URL, file path, and I'll change directories and paste it. No, I'm in the same place now in my command prompt or my terminal in my file system. So we want to create an application here. We have no files. So what we want to do, the first thing we're going to do is let's initialize NPM. That will walk us through. We did it last week. We'll do it again. It'll walk us through creating a package.json file. So I can just run the command npm init. We get the prompt saying this will let us create package.json. I'll keep this really simple. I'm just going to hit enter at all the prompts. I'm not going to change anything. I'll just accept all the default. So in brackets, whatever's in brown brackets, that's the default value that'll be here. So I just hit enter, version, no description. We'll leave the entry point as index for now. We can always change it. And then it previews out our little JSON file. Is this okay? I'll just hit enter and it'll generate. We'll see it show up in my directory here in a minute. If I just hit enter for is this okay? There's our package.json. So now I'm going to open up this folder in my code editor. So I'll close the project, and now I'm going to open my new project. So right now, the only thing in here is our package.json. Again, we could create this manually if we wanted to, but it's much easier to just use the init command. That's right. What does the error say? The problem is you have a space in the folder. Rename the folder, take out the space. Notice I had multiple words, but I used the dash. That's why it's the application name can't contain a space in it. The path. So now we've done this. We've got our application created. We've done this. It tells us to initialize npm, which we've done. So now we're going to install Express, and it's suggesting we use the ---- save option. Why do we? What does ---- save do? Right. That's -g sequence. So -g saves it globally. ---- save installs it, but also adds it to our package.json. So we'll run this command. We don't need to use the word install. You can just do the shortcut, which is I. So npm, I'm doing this version, npm I express ---- save.
NPM likes to have your Git repository before. So
yeah, you can certainly create the repository first and link it. You don't have to. So it installed Express, and you can see how many dependencies it actually added. 49 packages. So now my package.json updates automatically, and it says at least the current version of Express 4.16.2. Okay, so there's our install. Now it tells us something interesting. Actually, I never noticed this note before. By default, npm 5 will automatically now add it to a package.json. We no longer need ---- save so long as we've run npm in it. Just depends on what version of npm you have. Since we all installed npm recently, I have a feeling we all have version 5. We can check with npm -v. This will show you what version you have on your machine. I have 5.6. So I should be able to install without ---- save now. I wasn't aware of that, but that's useful.
Can I install Express without internet connection, right?
No, you need it. No.
That's what happened with me. My internet is not working. I don't know.
You can't install because, here's why. The way npm works, like it's got to come from somewhere. Right? So here's how popular Express is. 700,000 people have downloaded it in the last day. 17 million downloads in the last month. So all of the packages are on GitHub. So it pulls from that, pulls the source, all the npm packages. They have to be on GitHub and they have to be open source. So when you do an npm install, it goes to npm, finds the name of the package, looks up the repository, and downloads from there. So without an internet connection, you can't do it. So it comes right from here. Okay, so we're installed now. Everybody okay? Everybody have it installed? Any problems? Jaspreet, good? All right, great. Okay, so now let's try their hello world example. Now I should probably update my slide. This is a little bit more up to date. Now we already have actually, it said app.js. Okay. So let's change our main here. Our typical kind of startup file with Express is usually called app.js. So in our package.json, we'll get it to run with app.js instead of index.js. When we use the generator, it's going to build a file called app.js with all our startup code. And now let's create this file. So we'll create a new JavaScript file called app. So let's follow the documentation. Now they've used constant here instead of let, because those are not going to change. We could use either one. Just follow along here. So we're going to require Express. Again, the semicolons are optional. I'm in the habit of using them, so I'm going to continue to use them. Now, my slide's a little out of date, and I should update it. So here in the syntax was app.use / so any request that came to the root folder, we have this callback function that sends the message, sends the response, hello world. And we have this. We had this anonymous callback function because this is asynchronous, right? So here's our function with our request and response, but our function has no name. So this is kind of the older syntax. They've now updated their documentation. Notice the word function doesn't appear here anymore. We've replaced the word function with this, a fat arrow expression. These things are equivalent. So here's the old version. And here we don't put anything in front of the brackets. We just have this instead. Okay, so they're equivalent. Obviously, this one's a little shorter and easier. So why type the word function when we can put in 2 characters to represent it? So that's our anonymous callback function with our request and response. And this is what happens. It sends that response. So we can write the code either way. It's going to work exactly the same way. You can use either version. This one is a little shorter and simpler. So I'll follow the new version. So we're specifying when we have a GET request, not a POST, not a DELETE, not a PUT request, but when we get an HTTP GET request at the URL just / at our root, there's one other thing we did differently here. Last week we used res.write and then res.end. You might remember. And when we didn't call end, what happened? When we tried to load our page. We did res.write hello world, but we didn't put in res.end after. What happened? Yeah, the response never completed. So we never actually saw anything. Now we could do the same here. We could call res.write and then res.end, but the response object in Node has a bit of a shortcut. If you call res.send, it means write this response and end it. So it's just a shortcut. It's like combining those two methods into one. Sorry? Next would then have to call in the idea. Next then calls something else in the stack, typically. Could call something else. So now we just start our server on port 3000. And again, we have this Lambda expression, so this anonymous function. This one has no request or response. We can just log a message. So this version, you can see our code is shorter now. This was this was taken from their documentation a little while ago. And this is considerably less code, right? We had 1, 2. We've condensed 8 lines of code into 4. And for the moment, we don't even need to export it. So now we should be able to use our nodemon utility to run this. So I'll go to my command prompt. If I use nodemon, I don't think I need to specify the app.js because our package.json already shows that as the main. We'll see if I can run it just with nodemon. I may get an error. I may have to put in nodemon app. We'll see. Okay, I guess it would help if I paid attention to my code editor. My code editor gave me a red line, which I ignored. It was never a good idea. I'll save it. Nodemon automatically restarts, right? It starts app.js because our package.json, we've set that as the startup file, and now we should be able to hit this URL in the browser. Send our response. Now, most of the code that's in here, we're actually never going to have to write again because the Express generator is going to write most of this stuff for us, setting up the references and actually launching the server. We're not going to have to do it, but it's good that we at least tried it ourselves. So here's one example of the routing. We map that URL. If I go anywhere but the root, and I think we saw this last week, it says it cannot get, right? Get is the default HTTP method. So it's looking in our application somewhere for a mapping of what to do at that URL. Oh, here, well, actually, let's change it to like, what would we do to fix this? Yep, we could. Even simpler, how could we handle it right through here? so that we actually get something being displayed rather than cannot get. We can't do it here. You're getting warmer, Rob. We can't do it in here. We can only map one path per command. So this maps the root path. How would we map a separate path? Yeah, so we'll do another app.get. Map the path about. If we get a request here, we'll send a different response. So similar to what we did last week, right? We created 3 routes for home, about, and for the root, about, and contact, and we sent a different message in each one. Remember, Express is based on connect. So it works kind of the same way for mapping URLs. If I save that change, NodeMon successfully restarted. And now it can handle it. It knows what to do with when a request comes in at about. So this is fairly similar to what we did last week with mapping the URLs in Connect. If I pull up their example on their site, so they have, how to do basic routing. This is basically what we've done. Right? So we can handle get, post, put, which is used for updates, and delete all at the same URL. And then we write the appropriate code to interact with our database, depending on, even though it's the same URL, depending on what type of request we got. Are we getting, are we posting, are we putting, are we deleting? Now, here's one question for you, and then we'll take a break. Here we've only got 2 roots. We've got the root file and we've got the about. In an actual production application, right, we might have hundreds and hundreds of different views and different URLs to map. We're probably not going to want a list in this file. It's not really manageable to map every single root to a single. Right now we're sending a response. Later what we do is we actually render a view. So this response object has a render method. So we render or we load a view depending on the URL. So how do you suppose this is going to get handled if our site gets really, really big? We're not going to map every single URL in this one file. How do you suppose we might do it? Let's say we were rebuilding an application like Blackboard, right? So think of, we've got students, we've got instructors, we've got courses, we have assignments, we have grades. So we're going to have all these URLs. How would you organize that? How was it done in our ASP.NET application? Right? We had albums, we had genres, we had orders, we had customers. Why don't we have a look at our code for a second? There's no one file in our music store. Where in here, where did we map the URLs to the logic that would run at each different URL? Which layer handles the logic? Models, views, or controllers? Yeah, so in the controllers, did we map all the URLs for the entire site in one file? Or is this divided up? Right, so anything to do with any URLs to do with genres, the URLs were mapped here based on our method names. We had a index and we had a details. So for each section of the site, basically related to each table in the database, we had a controller, and that controller handled all of the URLs related to it. Same here, right? So for orders, we had index, details, just those two. So in our Express application, we're going to do the same thing. The generator is going to build a structure kind of like this one for us. It'll be a little simpler than this. And inside of the controllers is where we'll map all the individual URLs. So if we had a student's controller, all we would do here is we would do a mapping something like this. We will do this shortly. You don't add this, but just to show you what it looks like. Here's what this is going to look like. So we would create a student variable that references our student controller. And then we say any URL that starts with /students, go to that controller and it will handle all of the routes inside. So adding a student, editing a student, listing, logging in, whatever a student could do. We'll write a student controller with all of the methods that map all of the URLs that we're going to have for students, and each one of those calls a function and processes the logic for that URL. So we don't map all the URLs in one file. We'll create Express, Node and Express controllers for each part of the application. So it will actually be structured very similar to how Visual Studio did it for us. So this code is not going to live in here for now, but once we use the generator, this is how we're going to do it. That's all we were going to do with this simple application. So it's time for us to take a break. When we come back, so we'll come back at 9:05. We come back, we'll look at using the generator. We're going to use the generator from here on. Every assignment you build, you'll just use the generator to build a new site. And basically what we're going to do now, I'm going to start building the site with the generator today. And then like we did with the music store, I'm not going to build new ones again each week. We can just keep adding on to the site we're going to build today. This will be our starter and we'll build it out for the next while. What does it say?
Expression statement is not assigned.
Okay, what line number is that?
It's on 7. I have same problem. I guess when it's a problem on the lambda sign.
Sorry?
It's a problem on the lambda sign.
Okay. Okay. Is your syntax? Okay. That's because this is ES6 syntax. Your settings are, your code editors are probably set to ES5. So make sure in your code editor, go to File and Settings. And under Languages and JavaScript, make sure it's set to ECMAScript 6. This code was not available before version 6. The other place, you know why? There's default settings. So you may have to go into File and Default Settings because you created a new application. You don't want to change it just for this. You actually want to go into File and Default Settings and then change your JavaScript to ECMA 6. That's why it's not recognized. Okay, let's take a pause.